Little did I ever know that Aetna as a brand had historically been owned by the Rockefellers, David Rockefeller. In fact, initially, it wasn't even an insurance-based company. It was in coal, oil, and gas, and then begins underwriting insurance policies on human beings, slaves in the 1800s. But Aetna, as a trademark, goes way back. And then JP Morgan Chase actually is barred from insurance underwriting in the United States as of 1933. Not just that, securities underwriting as well. Why? Well, they led to the Great Depression. I say they because it was a network of bankers that included Brown, Harriman, and Root, JP Morgan, Huntington, etc. So from 1933 to 1996, all of those companies were barred from securities and insurance underwriting. What changed? William Clinton and Hillary Clinton accepted numerous insurance-based trusts for their efforts in repealing the Glass-Steagall, aka Bankers Act of 1933. But not just that, they allowed for JP Morgan Chase to merge with Travelers that had just acquired some of Aetna's historical businesses. Now that is banned. I mean, it's blocked last minute. So it has to be Citicorp that merges with Travelers. But either way, these mergers ahead of 9/11 were very strategic and are the exact same entities that have been used historically by the Rockefellers and Rothschilds to liquidate U.S. assets. So it just turns out, I look at Aetna in Stark County, and it's Aetna Credit Company that comes back to life, paying out credit from the Willard and Dunlap families. Willard and Dunlap, I said it since day one, that building that was titled and deeded to Jeffrey Epstein and Howard Lutnick had historically been in the Willard, aka Washington family. This was the hijacking of America. It started with the liquidation of the U.S. Farm Bureau, Texas Oil, and then went on to the McKinley and Washington trusts, our nation's trust. And so we've had politicians all the way up to the president who have signed on consistently. It's George H.W. Bush, who was hell-bent on making this plot in Operation Northwoods 2.0 go through. And Operation Northwoods 2.0 included the destruction of the World Trade Centers. It was all the way back to the 60s that was part of the plot. It also included shooting down a passenger airplane and changing the identities of the passengers, even falsifying funerals and gravestones, which I can confirm they've done. They've manipulated quite a few. Not to mention identities. Every element of 9/11, when you look into it, is overlapping with the Bush family. Even the security on the World Trade Center, Dulles International Airport, but it doesn't stop there. It's MCI Communications and Los Alamos. And then our own government approved for the CIA to work hand in hand with the Mossad and Dick Cheney and the Energy Task Force to claim all outstanding mineral rights that were still titled to U.S. historic trusts. And that's what 9/11 was all about. I mean, anyone out there with half a brain, if you look into the insurance-based activity in Franklin County, in the state of Ohio, it's downright appalling. And if you look into specific oil and gas companies, their mergers are right up to 9/11. The Farmers trademark transfers on 9/11. It transfers to Farmers Ethanol, a fake shell entity, whose first U.S. milestone is 9/11, 2001. Terrorists attack the United States of America. So Aetna is one of thousands of Rockefeller, Rothschild, shell-based insurance entities that reemerge ahead of 9/11. And as I mentioned, Aetna Credit is paying out on Dunlap Willard estates and trusts. See, they come back as bundles, and you'll see Aetna Casualty, Aetna Life, Aetna Credit Company, Aetna Fire Association, which one would think is relating to insurance. No, it's actually an association of investors that's paying out royalties globally through a network of banks. And in 1999 officially, but 1996 is when William Clinton allowed for JP Morgan, aka Rockefeller, to begin engaging in this type of activity despite having the fact that it led to the Great Depression. Now, the Clintons are recipients of Northwestern Mutual Life Trusts. And here's where you can see that the assignment of rents that they're paying out are $14.5 million. And that's numerous times a year. And they do it under a slew of shell-based entities. And when I look up Hillary Clinton's, they're actually based through the Union Swiss Bank, you know? And I see that there's two set up, and one of them is under V. Walker. That'd be Vince Walker Foster. And Vince Walker Foster was associated with Foster Farms and the liquidation of all of its assets through Case Farms, aka Case Corp, owned by Russia. I mean, I'm good. I'm good at what I do. I'm good. But the truth is, anyone who worked in U.S. government and actually audited this, most of them are dead. Most of them are on the Clinton list. Vince Foster being one great example. But Seymour Epstein is Seymour George Epstein, and that is Epstein's dad. He died apparently in Cuyahoga Falls for a reason. And this is all of the wells that had historically been titled to the Elms of Maslin, the Elms Country Club. And here are all the investors ahead of 9/11. Now, these are all shell entities. Don't get too hung up on the names. But I will tell you, it is the Chemical Bank and JP Morgan that had been illegally consolidating mineral rights that have been titled to the U.S. Farm Bureau through the Elms under Belden and Blake. Belden and Blake. And you see Henry Belden here? It's his estate that they kind of like replaced George H. Dunlap kind of here. But when we look him up and I pull his background report, he's a fake entity that was set up to liquidate assets offshore. And this is trillions of dollars in oil, gas, and coal. Trillions. And that's not all. They hijacked Texas oil and Gulf oil. And guess what the Rockefellers create immediately in 2011? The Rockefeller Ocean Fund. They create a domestic version and an international version. What was it set up to do? Accept the funds that BP, Halliburton, they were charged for the Deepwater Horizon. So they're on the receiving end. And then they also accepted insurance policies because they took out insurance on the Gulf. It's called Gulf insurance. That's what the Rockefellers do ahead of disasters. What do Henry Belden, Larry Fink, Larry Silverstein, Howard Lutnick, and Jeffrey Epstein, not to mention Leslie Wexner, all have in common? They received property, real estate, and mineral rights via UCC filings only, not deeds. They're UCC filings. What's a UCC? It's essentially a collateral loan, and they're taken out on historical trust titled property. The UCCs are a telltale sign of someone who's in our country working as a double agent, and what goes hand in hand with receiving their property via UCCs is agricultural based designation on the property. Yep, that's because they're defaulting it from the Farm Bureau. And then lots of shell-based entities transferring it. It is being vacant. And that's part of the plot. As vacant agricultural, Ranch at the Canyon Association. It's Belden and Blake that illegally had been consolidating mineral rights through the Elms, dating all the way back to the 60s, when Lyndon Johnson was living at the Elms. But these are the entities, Belden and Blake Corp., Belden and Blake LLC, and then Belden and Blake International, and all the different addresses that they assume. And I've said it since day one that Texas, Pennsylvania, potentially New York, but Ohio, all had been integrated with EDS and various systems on the back end to liquidate assets ahead of 9/11. Belden and Blake Corp., as of September 1st of 1999, was incorporated for one reason and one reason only, to assume the Patterson name, look, Patterson Airplanes identity, as well as all of the mineral rights historically titled to the U.S. Farmers Trust. Well, if you go in to Franklin County, Ohio, probate, here's Gladys Dunlap, and her estate is annexed and liquidated in 2015, and then George H. Dunlap, and his estate is 2019, just before Jeffrey Epstein is arrested. But they tell me that it's Glenn Scott Dunlap who is the beneficiary or newfound trustee as of 2019. But look, and he changes his name right in line with it, right? Glenn Scott Walker changes his name to Glenn Scott Dunlap, and then back to Latif Sade. See this? Glenn Scott Walker changes his name to Glenn Scott Dunlap, and then to Latif Sade. Can you imagine if that happened on 9/11? And with that in mind, it's actually John Dunlap, John and David Rockefeller. But look, if you go into his estate, John Dunlap, which is, 2001, this is ahead of 9/11, June to be exact, that it's open, and then liquidated as part of this nationwide separate account trust. But look, the case name is Hutton, aka John Dunlap. And that's how the CIA and Mossad got to operate ahead of 9/11 in manipulating records and transferring securities offshore.